Hello, today is Thursday, October 30th, 2025. I'm Tony Mangino from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. I've asked my friend and colleague Laura McDonald, a partner at LB3, to walk me through a question I often get from clients, and that is, when doing a deal, whose paper should the enterprise start with? They start with their own paper, which was carefully crafted to reflect their interests and the services they are purchasing, or start with the vendors after providing the vendor with a handful of key terms for inclusion. Laura, thanks for joining me today.
Tony, it's great to be here. And that's a question I hear all the time as well.
Okay, so that means you have the answer, right?
I have answers, but it's often the case the answers vary based on the circumstances.
And that's a very lawyerly answer, but I'll bite. What impacts
All
the
right. You ask a lawyer a question, that's what you get. The primary things that drive the whose paper question are leverage, the size of the deal, and the type of services, where you are in the process, how much time and energy you're willing to invest. Those are kind of the four critical features.
I get the question most often when we're helping prepare an RFP. Does it matter if the company is about to engage in an RFP process?
Absolutely. And that if a company is doing an RFP and is asking a range of providers to respond, the company has two good options. One is to add the key legal and commercial clauses or concepts, like you mentioned, or ask for a response to a carefully crafted MSA and include that as part of the RFP response.
Won't adding an MSA just bog down the process?
Absolutely can. The disadvantage of putting in an MSA is that you must either bifurcate the process or be prepared to allow the providers to have more time to respond to the RFP. There are other disadvantages as well, frankly. One is the provider may bring in its own team of lawyers whose first response is to say no, even if they internally understand that there are things that they will have to give up going down the road to save the business. You also might run into a resource strapped provider, those who don't really have the legal resources handy. So you get a response that's been reviewed really primarily by the business folks. And I've been in a situation where that's happened. And when we got into the finalizing of the contract, the provider's lawyer tried to claw back a large part of the concessions because they hadn't been properly reviewed. So that is a risk that you run. And frankly, you, the company, may not have the time or resources to put into crafting an MSA. Remember, you have to build that into your own prep time. So, my experience is even companies that have their own model MSA that they use for a wide range of things, they have to spend a fair amount of time to customize and craft it to meet the business needs the particularities of the providers and the services that they're looking at, what's going on in the market, regulatory issues, but frankly, always something that differs and is important to look at in the technology and telecom space. And they have to make sure what they're asking for really works for the business needs of the folks that are going to be using those services and what their long term or prior relationship is with the providers.
I think you've effectively talked me out of using an MSA as part of the RFP process. Plus, I've seen supplier positions on specific commercial terms that may reside in the MSA evolve over the course of an RFP, as a part of a pricing concession.
Yeah, Tony, I absolutely get it. But I'd caution you not to immediately discount using an MSA as part of the RFP process because I've seen it not work. I've also seen it work really well, particularly when the company has leverage and is really looking to a new solution and is willing to put in the work and has the resolve. I had a client who started with pretty mediocre paper and they ended up with two very strong MSAs from two of the providers responding, which also included good pricing and commercial terms. And these MSAs lasted so that down the road there were fewer edits and changes that needed to be made as you inevitably add services or extend things. So that can really work. Another thing in this instance, the provider who was the incumbent who just kind of threw up all over the RFP ended coming back a couple of years later and agreeing to a much stronger contract in order to get some of the business back. I've also had it short circuit the negotiation process after the RFP is complete. So, really, what it does is it front loads the work. And so, while you may spend more time in the RFP, you spend less time negotiating the contract. This really works best where all or most of the providers are new to the company or in something like a brand new service or managed services or CCAS or something like that. Plus, the advantage, frankly, of starting with your own MSA means that instead of negotiating to get improvements to a bad provider form, the provider has to negotiate to get its own provisions into your contract. Just a warning there, you got to be reasonable because each provider does have their own business processes that need to be accounted for. So you can't just assume that they'll accept it lock, stock, and barrel. I did want to circle back a little bit to your point about the concessions along the way because it's a really good one. I think that really happens in either scenario. And that goes really towards if you have the resolve to push for what you really need and it is an important item, you can often prevail. If it's not an important item or the resources and the push isn't there, then it can work against you as well.
Laura, can you accomplish the same thing by putting in a limited group of clauses or concepts in the RFP?
Absolutely. You can accomplish a fair amount with that process, and that requires less leverage and less advanced work, although it does require advanced work. That method keeps you from getting bogged down with fighting with the lawyers at the get go. It forces you and the provider to really focus on what's important to you and what needs to be in the contract. So it takes fewer resources up front and sometimes along the way. You do, though, have to factor in the time and the resources to make sure that when you get the contract, those clauses that you thought through and added are incorporated into that contract. And you're still going to have to work and negotiate to get out unfavorable or restrictive clauses in the provider's form.
Laura, what other factors impact the decision on whose paper you start with?
Another critical factor is the size of the deal and the provider. If you're doing a small deal or a refresh, then really in most cases, it doesn't make sense to start with your own paper unless the provider is a new entrant and is really eager for the business and doesn't really have enterprise ready forms or it's mission critical and you really have to have your provisions.
I can't imagine giving new paper in the case of a refresh of an existing deal outside of the RFP process we discussed.
Tony, I absolutely agree. There are one or two exceptions. One exception is where it's a really old existing agreement and it has a gazillion amendments. In that case, sometimes starting fresh makes sense, either as an amended and restated or a new paper. But again, that's going to take more time and more resources. So it's a risk reward assessment. What can you live with? How has the market changed? Have your needs changed? The size of the deal? All those things have to be taken into account. But in most cases, it doesn't make sense.
I've found that leverage really is a key factor in how you structure the deal. If your company has a long partnership with a provider and has little ability or willingness to move services, then putting new paper in front of that provider is likely an exercise in futility.
Tell you, we continue to be simpatico. You have to be realistic about your timing and leverage. And sometimes you just have to hold your nose and pick the handful of key issues you really want to focus on. You just need to be thoughtful and make sure those are the ones that give the company the flexibility it needs and limits the critical risk. And keep in mind where you are, because maybe, like in the example I gave you, a year or two down the road, you will be in a position where you can use your paper or do a better refresh of the documents. Also, Tony, remember that the providers know their paper. They've vetted it. It makes life easier for them. So while it often makes sense to start with the provider's paper, make sure that's a decision your company is making and not letting the provider make for you.
Well, Laura, how can they do that?
By delaying, escalating, or just continuing to insist on using their paper, you just have to be prepared for that, have a plan, and have a fallback.
So, in short, I think you're saying there's a time and a place for starting with your own company paper and a time and a place for starting with the provider's paper.
Spot on. And to be honest, the provider paper is written to protect the provider. So even when that path makes sense, and frankly, it does much of the time, you want to make sure that before you get the paper, you're outlining those key provisions that you have to have. You understand that. You also want to make sure that, as I said before, your clauses are included in the final version and you've read it, you understand it to make sure it's not what they say is in it, but what's actually in it, and that you can live with it. And unless you're buying a printer from a retailer, a big box store, and you have no leverage or other options, you should always do your due diligence and you can almost always get some improvements.
Always a good reminder, Laura. Thanks for joining us today. And if any of our listeners have any questions or would like to learn more about how to assess what paper to use or to discuss best practice for sourcing and contracting deals, please don't hesitate to contact Laura, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or shooting us an email. You can also stay current by subscribing to Staying Connected, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.